I recently sat in on a mid-career recruitment interview for a mid-sized tech firm. And across from us was this man, maybe late 40s, a former section chief at one of Japan's, most prestigious global conglomerates. He sat with perfect posture, just radiating this quiet, seasoned confidence, the kind of confidence you get from spending 2 decades on the elite generalist track. He spoke so eloquently about cross-departmental synergy and strategic coordination, and my favorite, managing stakeholder expectations. To any casual observer, he looked like the very definition of a corporate titan. Then the hiring manager, he just leans forward and asks this one single blunt question. He says, if our main server goes down at 2 a.m., or if we need to draft a specific technical implementation plan for a new client by Monday morning, what part of that work do you physically sit down and complete with your own hands? The silence that followed was just deafening. The candidate's face didn't just drop. It was like it seemed to hollow out from the inside. He starts stammering, about overseeing the workflow and authorizing the necessary budget for vendors. But that conviction in his voice from before, it was just gone. And it became painfully clear right there in that room that for 20 years, he hadn't actually performed work. He had simply managed the symbols of it. He was master of this specialized internal language that meant absolutely nothing once he stepped outside his company's front doors. It made me realize that in the modern Japanese landscape, we've perfected a system of prestigious labels. Science track, humanities track, elite generalist, that sounds so rigorous, but are increasingly detached from any functional reality. We're witnessing the era of job titles without jobs. It's a system where large corporations have outsourced their brains to contractors and their hands to dispatch agencies, leaving behind this core class of employees who serve no purpose other than to occupy a hierarchy. When you sweep away the vendors and the agency staff, you're left with a really uncomfortable question. What exactly is the core employee actually there to do? That story, it just stays with me because it feels less like an interview anecdote and more like a ghost story for the modern professional.
A ghost story. It's apt.
Yeah, you spend 20 years climbing a ladder, perfect posture, perfect suit, only to realize the ladder isn't actually leaning against anything solid. It's just floating there in midair.
It is a horror story, but in a very specific economic sense. It's that moment of realization, the moment you see you've become a hollowed out professional.
Hollowed out, that's the perfect term for it.
You have the shell, right? You have the title, the business cards, the social status, but the core, the actual tangible ability to produce economic value with your own hands or your own brain, it's just evaporated.
And the really terrifying part is that he didn't know it was happening. Not until that exact moment in that specific chair with that question hanging in the air.
Because he wasn't a bad employee.
No. That's what gets me. He wasn't a scammer. He wasn't lying. In his world, he genuinely believed that coordinating synergy was a job.
And inside his previous company, it was a job. That's the trap we're talking about today. We are looking at a systemic decay within what we used to think of as the Japanese meritocracy.
Okay, a systemic decay.
We have these prestigious labels, the elite generalist, the science track graduate. That used to be a guarantee of a certain level of capability. But over the last few decades, the connection between those labels and any actual skill has been, it's been severed.
It's like a kind of professional currency devaluation. You're holding a briefcase full of cash, your section chief title, and you walk into the market to buy a new job, and the shopkeeper just looks at you and says that currency isn't worth the paper it's printed on.
And so our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the mechanics of that very devaluation. We're not just here to complain about middle managers.
Sure, it's too easy to do that.
We need to look at the input problem, how universities and HR departments sort people into these hollow roles in the first place. Then we need to examine the process, how the act of outsourcing strips away the company's core and the employee's ability to judge quality.
And finally, the output.
And the output. The tragedy of the unemployable executive, the end result of this entire conveyor belt.
Yes, because I think a lot of people, they hear a big name company, a Sony, a Mitsubishi, a Toyota, and they just assume you must be doing something important. But what you're saying is there's a huge disconnect between the prestige and the actual function.
A massive disconnect. And it starts long before anyone even sits in an interview room. It starts with how we label human beings in the education system itself.
Which brings us to what you call the sorting hat.
Exactly, the corporate sorting hat.
I was digging through our source material on this, specifically this whole science versus humanities divide, and I found a case study that, it just perfectly illustrates this input problem you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's about a guy named Kenji. So Kenji graduates from a good university with a degree in environmental science. He spent 4 years in labs, dealing with real data, thinking about sustainability.
So a hard science background, he has technical skills.
Exactly. He gets recruited during that mass hiring season by a top-tier electronics conglomerate. And because he has a science degree, HR immediately tags him as Decay Science Track.
Which sounds promising. I mean, on the face of it, you'd expect him to be routed into R&D or maybe product design, something technical.
You would think. But that's not what happened at all. For the last 15 years, Kenji has been managing spreadsheets in the logistics department.
Wow. From environmental science to logistics spreadsheets, that's a leap.
A huge leap. And when he asked his boss about it, why they were using this one specific, incredibly outdated data tracking method, his manager just kind of shrugged and said, "You're a science guy, Kenji. You understand logic. You figure it out."
But there was no logic to figure out, was there?
None. It was just legacy bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And that's when Kenji realized his science label wasn't about his expertise. It had nothing to do with environmental science. It was just a bucket. HR needed to dump 500 new bodies into various departments, and science was just their internal shorthand for put this guy in a room with a lot of numbers.
And this is the absolute core tragedy of the Shinsotsu Ikatsu Sayo system. That is, the mass hiring of new graduates all at once. To really get our heads around why Kenji ended up there, you have to look at the logistics of it from the company's point of view.
It still just seems so inefficient. I mean, why would you hire a guy trained in environmental science to do logistics admin? Why not just hire, I don't know, a logistics major?
Because in the traditional Japanese university system, a logistics major, in that kind of vocational sense, it barely exists. But more importantly, the company doesn't actually care what you studied. They care about your capacity.
Your capacity for what, though?
Capacity for work, for enduring work. Just picture the scene in April. A major corporation hires, say, 500, maybe 600 fresh graduates. They all show up in the same black suit. They all have the exact same amount of work experience, which is 0.
It's a factory line of people.
It is a factory line. And from an HR perspective, trying to evaluate the specific individual technical skills of 600 people in a 2-week window is basically impossible. You can't interview 600 people deeply enough to know if they're truly good at environmental science versus, say, just good at passing exams about it.
So you need a shortcut.
Yeah.
A heuristic.
You need a proxy indicator. And the two biggest ones are the prestige of the university you went to and this very broad label of your major.
Humanities, Bunki, and science.
Exactly. And you have to understand, these are academic categories. They're designed for the university entrance exams. They're not job descriptions. But once you get into the corporate world, they morph into these weird personality assessments.
Right. So humanities graduates are what? Assumed to be good communicators, maybe a little flighty, good at talking to people.
So they go to sales or HR or marketing, and the science graduates are stereotyped as logical, maybe a bit socially awkward, but comfortable with pain. So they go to IT or accounting or, in Kenji's case, logistics.
Wait, comfortable with pain? That sounds pretty ominous.
It's a real part of the stereotype. The thinking is that the science track in university is just harder. You have more lab hours, the exams are tougher. So HR looks at someone like Kenji, and they don't see a scientist. They see someone who survived a difficult ordeal.
So the thinking is, he survived the science track. He can definitely handle the boring, mind-numbing, grindy work of logistics spreadsheets for a decade without quitting.
You've got it. Kenji isn't a scientist to them. He's a grade A grinder.
Oh.
And one of our main sources, the book Job Titles Without Jobs, points out that in the modern office, this distinction is collapsing anyway. The work itself has converged. A humanities marketing manager is staring at Google Analytics data all day.
That's data science, basically.
And a science logistics manager is on the phone negotiating with trucking vendors all day. That's communication. But the labels, these archaic labels, they remain stuck in the 19th century.
But surely the universities themselves are aware of this, right? I mean, if you're a professor at, say, the University of Tokyo, are you really okay with your most brilliant science students just becoming spreadsheet jockeys?
The universities are an integral part of this machine. And to understand why, we have to look at the history here. The Tokyo Center for Economic Research has a great paper on what it calls educational credentialism. It traces the whole thing back to the Meiji period.
We're going all the way back to the 1800s for this.
We have to, if we want to understand the DNA of the system. The original imperial universities were founded for one main purpose: to train the government elite.
The bureaucracy.
The bureaucracy. The goal wasn't to create innovators in the way we think of it now, but to create a class of highly capable people who could run the state. And the entrance exam was the primary filter for that.
So the test is the qualification. Passing the test is the skill.
Yes. And that created what some scholars call the serial model of elite formation. The university provides the raw material people with general aptitude, high IQ, and most importantly, the proven ability to follow instructions and endure pressure. Then the company provides all the specific on-the-job training.
Okay, but hold on a second. If I spend 4 years of my life studying law or engineering at a top school, surely that has to count for something. Are you really telling me the actual content of the degree is irrelevant in this model?
In this specific traditional model, largely yes. And this is where that serial model idea gets really, really interesting. You have to stop thinking of the university as a place of learning and start thinking of it as a filtration device for compliance.
A filter for compliance.
The entrance exams, the infamous examination hell, are brutally difficult. Passing one doesn't just prove you're smart, it proves you can suffer through a high-pressure, high-stakes, frankly arbitrary environment for years without cracking. It proves you can memorize vast amounts of information and regurgitate it perfectly on command.
And the company looks at that and says, great, this kid can handle 14-hour days, he won't ask too many questions, and he'll do what he's told.
Exactly. The serial model assumes the university's job is to deliver raw material grade A. And the company, frankly, wants a blank slate. They don't want a pre-trained engineer who comes in with their own ideas about how to do things. They want to create a Mitsubishi engineer or a Hitachi engineer from the ground up.
So if you come in with too many of your own ideas or strong vocational habits from another company or another way of thinking, you're actually harder to train in their specific corporate way.
You're much harder to train. You're not malleable. That's the key word. Malleable. And that's why they've historically preferred fresh graduates over mid-career experts. The fresh grad is pure, uncut potential that they can shape.
And historically, you can see how that might have worked. In the post-war era, when technology moved a lot slower, you could hire a smart history major and over 10 years, teach them how to run a bank branch.
Of course. But today, the world is different. You can't take that same history major and teach them to be a cloud architect or a machine learning specialist in a 3-month orientation program.
The complexity of the actual work has completely outpaced the generalist training model.
Completely. But the hiring pipeline, the fundamental mechanism, hasn't changed. And this leads directly to that Reddit discussion we were looking at, the one about the 98% graduate employment rate.
Which on the surface sounds like an amazing statistic. 98% of graduates find a job. I mean, in a lot of Western countries, they'd kill for that number.
It sounds like an economic paradise. But what the users on Reddit were pointing out is the catch. There's a huge catch. It's a seller's market for entry, but it becomes a buyer's market for agency.
Okay, explain what that means. A seller's market for entry, a buyer's market for agency.
It means you are basically guaranteed a job. If you have a degree from a decent university and a pulse, you will get in somewhere. But in exchange, you become a kigyu senshi, a corporate soldier. You essentially sign away your right to choose your profession.
You're not hired as an engineer. You're hired as a member of the company.
That is the official terminology. And if the company decides that member X needs to move from a Tokyo marketing role to a warehouse in Saitama to count boxes for the next 3 years, well, you go.
You can't really say, but wait, I studied environmental science.
You can say it, and they will listen politely and then say, thank you for your input. The moving truck will be there on Tuesday.
So you're trading your professional freedom for job security.
That's the deal. But as we're about to see in our next section, that security is rapidly becoming an illusion because once you are inside that system, doing a job that doesn't align with your skills, you begin to hollow out day by day.
And that brings us perfectly to the process problem. So we've taken Kenji, our raw material, we've sorted him into the wrong job. Now let's look at what happens 20 years later. Let's talk about Akiko.
Right. Akiko represents the next stage, the managerial layer of this whole crisis.
So Akiko is what's known as a Sogo Shoku, a general track manager at a major domestic bank. And I was reading this just harrowing account from someone who was on her team.
Okay.
Last year, their bank suffered a massive catastrophic system failure. We're talking ATMs down, online banking completely frozen, total chaos for customers.
The worst case scenario for a bank.
Absolutely. And as the manager of the digital transformation unit, Akiko was, on paper, responsible for the resolution. She was the one in charge.
But
when the crisis actually hit, she just froze. She completely seized up because in that moment of chaos, She realized she had absolutely no idea how the bank's core software actually functioned. Not a clue.
Because it had all been outsourced.
Every last bit of it. Over the last 2 decades, the bank had systematically outsourced every single technical function to external vendors. The big system integrators like NTT Data or IBM Japan, all under the guise of focusing on core management.
Core management, which is almost always a corporate euphemism for cost-cutting and headcount reduction.
So Akiko's entire career, her entire job function, had been to manage the relationship with these vendors. She negotiated their contracts, she approved their schedules, she took them out for lunch, but she couldn't read a single line of their code.
So when the servers actually crashed, what did she do?
She sat in her glass-walled office, nodding her head during crisis meetings she didn't understand, while the vendors engineered, the people who actually had the skills, fixed the problem. She held the title, she held all the responsibility, but she possessed none of the agency to actually do anything.
This is a perfect, almost textbook illustration of what sociologists call institutional anomie.
That's a heavy term. Break that down for us. What does that mean in this context?
Anomie, in a classical sense, refers to a societal breakdown, a state of normlessness. In this corporate context, it refers to the breakdown of the connection between a person's role and their capability. Akiko is a manager. The title implies she has the knowledge and the power to direct the work, but she manages nothing but symbols.
Budgets, timelines, PowerPoint decks.
Exactly, the symbols of work, not the work itself.
But hold on, isn't this happening everywhere? I mean, American and European companies outsource their IT all the time. Is this really a uniquely Japanese problem?
They do, that's true, but there is a critical difference in the internal structure and philosophy. In a typical Western model, if you outsource your IT, you almost always keep a principal architect or a deeply technical CTO in-house whose job it is to oversee the quality of the vendor's work.
But you need someone on your side of the table who knows if the code they're delivering is complete garbage or not.
You need someone internal who can call bullshit on the vendor when necessary. But in the Japanese job title without a job phenomenon, that internal expert is often gone. They were rotated out years ago because of the generalist system. Akiko isn't a technical lead who rose through the ranks. She's a generalist who was in HR 3 years ago and might be in audit 3 years from now.
So she literally lacks the vocabulary, the fundamental knowledge, to assess the quality of the work she's paying millions for.
That is the institutional anomie. It's not just that the work has been outsourced, it's that the standard of judgment has been outsourced along with it. If the vendor tells her this critical fix will take 500 man-hours and cost 10 million yen, Akiko has no internal reference point to say, no, that's absurd. That's a 2-hour job.
She just has to trust them.
She has to trust them completely because her own internal capacity, her organization's knowledge base has been hollowed out. She is, in a very real sense, at the mercy of the very people she is supposed to be managing.
That must be an incredibly stressful position to be in. I mean, we talk about these people as if they're just useless, but can you imagine the sheer anxiety of being held responsible for a complex system you fundamentally do not understand?
Fine, and this connects directly to the late David Graeber's theory on bullshit jobs.
Right, the idea that a huge chunk of modern white-collar work is essentially pointless.
Exactly. Graeber argued that capitalism has created millions of jobs that are effectively just pointless administrative loops. In Japan, this problem is compounded by a corporate structure that essentially got frozen in time in the 1980s.
So, I mean, why didn't market forces streamline this? Why didn't they get rid of all the bloat?
Because for a very long time, they didn't have to. Until very recently, Japan lacked the powerful mechanism of the hostile takeover. In the US or the UK, if a company gets bloated with layers of middle managers who don't add value, a private equity firm or an activist investor comes in, buys it, fires half the management, and streamlines the whole operation.
It's ruthless, but it's efficient.
Very. In Japan, the system of cross-shareholdings, where friendly companies all own small stakes in each other to protect the incumbent management, shielded these low-return megacore from that kind of pressure. They could survive for decades with incredibly inefficient structures.
So they just kept layering more middle management on top of the existing middle management.
And you end up with layers of people managing other people who are in turn managing the vendors who are actually doing the work. This is the environment that creates the phenomenon of the Madogiwa Zoku.
The Wingdo tribe.
Wingdo tribe.
I've always found that term so poetic, yet so completely devastating.
It is the ultimate physical manifestation of the job title without a job. These are employees, usually older managers, who have been sidelined. There's literally no work for them to do. But because of the social contract of lifetime employment and the legal difficulty of firing regular employees, They can't be let go.
So the company just gives them a desk, a title, and nothing. They're warehoused.
They're warehoused. They might be told to read the newspaper. They might browse the internet all day. Some of the sources mention they're assigned busy work, like copying documents that nobody needs. They are physically present. They are on the payroll, but they have been functionally hollowed out.
But that must just destroy your soul. I mean, getting paid to do nothing sounds kind of fun for a week, maybe two. But for 10 years, to have to show up every day, put on a suit, and just sit there while everyone around you pretends you're not there.
And that's where you have to understand the salaryman ethos. The cultural context is everything. The terms that are used, like shachuku, which means corporate livestock, or kaisho no inu, the company's dog, these aren't just funny insults. They reflect a reality where, for a long time, your entire identity was subsumed by the company you worked for.
So even if your job is to stare out the window all day, you are still a Mitsubishi man or a Toyota man, and that identity is what keeps you showing up day after day.
Yes. And just notice the progression we've seen. Kenji was the input, the raw material that got sorted incorrectly. Akiko is the process, the manager who is struggling to manage symbols. The window tribe is the residue. It's what's left over when the system can't find a use for you anymore, but it won't let you go either.
Which brings us to the inevitable logical conclusion of this entire life cycle. The output. What happens when the elite generalist finally tries to leave the corporate bubble?
Or, perhaps more accurately, what happens when the bubble bursts underneath them?
I want to talk about Sato-san. This story from the source material really struck me because it just completely challenges our conventional idea that experience is always a valuable asset.
Okay.
So Sato-san retires at 60 after a long and, by all internal measures, distinguished career at a traditional trading house. He was the ultimate generalist. He'd been rotated every 3 years like clockwork, from HR to sales to internal auditing, you name it.
He was a master of the internal bureaucracy. He knew the whole machine.
He was the machine. Inside his company, he was a king. He knew every single unwritten rule. He knew which Hanko stamp needed to go on which document. He knew exactly how to phrase a request to get it approved by the board without any friction.
A very valuable person inside that specific building.
Exactly. But when he retired, he found he was bored. He wanted to keep working. So he goes to a headhunter, hoping to land a nice senior consulting role. The recruiter looks at his very impressive resume and says to him, "Sato-san, with all due respect, you have 35 years of experience in being an employee of Company X, but you have 0 years of experience in any specific marketable skill."
Ouch. That is just brutal.
35 years of experience in being an employee of Company X. I mean, that just burns. The recruiter laid it out for him. You can't build a financial model. You can't devise a digital marketing strategy. You can't write a line of code. You can't run a modern, just-in-time supply chain. The only thing you know how to do is manage the internal politics of a company that you no longer work for.
And that is the generalist trap in its final, tragic form. And it's the direct, predictable result of that job rotation system we were just discussing.
But I always thought the whole point of job rotation was to make you a better leader. The idea is that you get to understand the whole business from every angle, right?
Mm-hmm. That was the logic, yes. And in the high-growth era of the 70s and 80s, it made a certain kind of sense. You were grooming future executives. But in today's highly specialized global economy, it just prevents you from ever mastering a single trade. You become an expert in nothing but your company's bureaucracy.
You know who to call to get a stamp. You know how to format the ringy, the internal approval document, just right so that the boss will sign it without reading it.
All incredibly valuable skills for navigating that specific corporate culture, but those skills are completely non-transferable. You can't put good at getting Tanaka-san to sign off on budgets on a resume you're sending to a different company. Tanaka-san isn't there.
Right.
Mid-career hiring is vacancy-driven. If I'm a hiring manager at a new company, I have a specific concrete problem I need solved. I need someone to fix my broken server or to run my digital marketing campaign. I don't need someone to coordinate stakeholders. I need output. Sato-san offers process management, but the market is demanding functional, tangible output.
And there's a specific term for these people, the ones who stay in one company their entire lives, right?
Yes. They're called hainuki. It means homegrown or born and bred within the company. And the Japan Labor Issues Journal we looked at points out a really disturbing trend for these hainukis. Their tenure wage profile is flattening.
So that old promise, stay loyal to us and we'll keep paying you more and more every year until you retire, that promise is breaking.
Because of Japan's aging workforce, there's a bottleneck at the top. There are too many older workers and not enough senior management posts to go around. So you have these lifers who hit a promotional ceiling in their late 40s or early 50s.
And they can't leave.
They're trapped. They're blocked from further promotion, but they can't leave and find a comparable job elsewhere because, like Sato-san, they have no external market value. They are trapped in the very system they dedicated their entire lives to.
It's a tragic situation for these middle managers. But I want to pivot to something that I find even more, infuriating. This hollow phenomenon isn't just happening to the victims of the system. It's also happening by design to the architects of the system at the very top.
Yes. You're talking about the advisor system, the world of the Soranyaku and the Komon.
It sounds like a rank in the mafia. The advisor.
In some ways, the comparison isn't that far off. This is where the job title without a job reaches its most prestigious and its most expensive form. These are the former CEOs and chairmen who retire, but, they don't actually leave.
So they step down from the board, but they keep the corner office.
They step down as CEO, but they stay on in a newly created role like senior advisor or executive counselor. They often keep their private office, their secretary, their corporate car, and a salary that can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And what exactly is their job description? What do they do?
Well, in theory, their job is to offer wisdom. They are there to gently guide the new CEO with their decades of experience. In practice, however, they often become what you might call the ghosts of the boardroom. They wield immense unchecked influence without any of the corresponding legal accountability.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. Influence without accountability is just a recipe for disaster.
The Asian Corporate Governance Association, the ACGA, published a report that highlights this perfectly. These advisors often exist primarily to protect their own legacies. So if the current CEO wants to shut down a loss-making division that the old Soranyaku started 10 years ago, the Soranyaku might use his influence behind the scenes to block it.
It's all about don't you dare touch my pet project, even if it's bleeding money.
And we have to look at the Toshiba accounting scandal because it is the perfect crime of the advisor system. For years, you had 3 generations of former presidents Nishida, Sasaki, and Tanaka all looming over the company at the same time as advisors.
It's like having 3 mothers-in-law living in your house while you're trying to cook dinner.
It's worse. Imagine those mothers-in-law also control your bank account but don't have to pay any of the bills. In Toshiba's case, these advisors would attend executive meetings. They would sit at the head of the table. And when the actual current CEO tried to present realistic lower profit targets, the advisors who were obsessed with maintaining the legacy of the high-growth quarters they ran would publicly scold him.
They would bully the sitting CEO into committing fraud.
Relentlessly. They demanded what they called the challenge.
So the job title without a job, in this case, is actually a weapon. It's a shield. It allows you to control the company from the shadows without ever being sued when the company inevitably explodes.
Precisely. It is the ultimate hollowing out of corporate governance. And even when companies claim they're getting rid of these positions, they often cheat. You have to look at the Fuji Media case.
Oh, I saw this one. They made a big public announcement that they were abolishing the Soranyaku position to improve governance, and the shareholders all applauded.
And then literally 2 days after the shareholder meeting, they quietly announced that the former president was being appointed to a new special position, advisor.
It's the same job, just with a different label.
It's the science versus humanities trick all over again. You change the label on the box, but you don't change the contents.
This paints such a bleak picture. We've got young people being sorted into boxes they don't fit in. We have middle managers managing processes they don't understand, and we have old executives haunting the boardroom to prevent any real change. What is the human toll of all this?
The human toll is, it's severe. We have to talk about the phenomenon of karoshi, death by overwork.
Okay, but I want to play devil's advocate here for a second. If these jobs are so hollow and bullshit, as Graeber would say, then why are people working themselves to death? If Akiko's job is just to nod at vendors, why is she so stressed out? Shouldn't she be relaxed?
That is the great paradox of the hollow job. When your job has no tangible, measurable output, the only way to prove your value to the organization is through the performance of work. Not the actual performance of work, but the performance of busyness.
You have to look busy at all times.
You have to look busier than anyone else. If your job is to make a chair, at the end of the day, you can point to the chair and say, I did that. I created value. I can go home now. But if your job is to coordinate synergy, How do you prove that you worked hard today?
You have to stay until 10 p.m. You have to be seen at your desk. You have to send emails at midnight. You have to be seen to be suffering for the company.
So the lack of real productive work actually creates more fake performative work to fill the void. Long hours become a proxy for efficiency and loyalty. And this, of course, leads to immense stress.
Right.
The Japan Labor Issues report we read mentioned a significant rise in mental disorders among salaried workers. And just think about Akiko again. She is held responsible for this massive, complex banking system, but she has been systematically denied the knowledge to understand it. That is a terrifying psychological state to be in.
It's the ultimate nightmare of imposter syndrome. But in her case, it's not a syndrome. She really is an imposter, but it's not her fault. The system made her one by never letting her learn the actual skills of her trade.
And then beyond the individual human cost, there is the broader economic consequence, and that is innovation stagnation. If everyone in your core team is a coordinator who is actually inventing the next product.
No one inside the company is. They've outsourced the brains for that. And this is where the AI threat becomes truly existential for this class of worker. I saw some chatter on Reddit about this with the headline, "Middle managers fade as AI rises."
Well, just think about the core function of a coordinator. If your job is to take information from a vendor, format that information into a standardized report, and then pass that report up to an executive, that is a task that is perfectly suited for AI.
AI is the ultimate coordinator. It doesn't need lunch breaks or get tired.
AI can summarize the vendor's email in seconds. AI can check the budget request against the approved spreadsheet. If your primary value to the company is processing and relaying information rather than creating novel insights or performing technical execution, you are directly in the blast radius of this technology.
So the coordinator class, the very people we've been talking about this entire deep dive, are ironically the most vulnerable to automation.
Absolutely. The hands, the manual labor, can be hard to automate in some cases. Think of a plumber or a nurse. The brains, the high-level strategy and creativity, still requires human judgment. But that middle layer, the coordination, the bureaucratic shuffling, the management of symbols, that is prime territory for AI to take over.
It really feels like the walls are closing in on the traditional Japanese salaryman. The technology is coming for their hollow jobs, and the open market is rejecting their generalist skills. Is there any kind of safety net for them?
There is, interestingly enough, what's being called a second safety net. The Japan Labor Issues Journal discusses the job seekers support system.
What's that?
It was a system originally designed for non-regular workers, the freeders, the part-timers, people who didn't have traditional employment insurance. It offers free vocational training and a small monthly allowance to help them reskill.
Retraining. So learning how to actually do things.
Yes. But the fascinating and tragic thing is that increasingly we might see regular employees, the Satos and Akikos of the world, needing to use this system. Because when they finally leave these hollow corporate jobs after 30 years, they are functionally in the same boat as a high school graduate who's never had a skilled job. They need to learn a trade from scratch.
That is such a humbling thought. The elite generalist who spent 2 or 3 decades in a nice suit in a skyscraper standing in line for vocational training alongside the part-time convenience store worker they used to look down on.
It is the great leveling. The market, at the end of the day, doesn't care about your past title. It only cares about your present skill.
So we've tracked this entire journey, from the university entrance exam all the way to the retirement line. And it seems to be a journey of doing everything right, of following the rules, doing what you're told, and ending up professionally empty.
We've gone from the mass-hired science grad who ends up doing data entry to the manager who just manages vendors, all the way up to the advisor who only manages his own legacy.
And the real tragedy isn't that these people were lazy or incompetent.
No, it's the opposite. They were loyal. They worked incredibly hard. They followed the rules of a system that was designed for the 1980s, an era of endless domestic growth and population expansion that simply doesn't exist anymore. The system itself hollowed out their careers while promising them security.
It feels like the ultimate betrayal, doesn't it? The company took their time, their loyalty, their life's energy, and gave them a title in return. But it denied them a craft.
A title without a craft. That is a perfect way to summarize it. And in today's open global talent market, a title without a craft is effectively worthless.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I think for anyone listening, especially if you happen to be sitting in an office right now, some of this might be a little uncomfortable to hear.
Yeah.
But it's probably better to face it now than 20 years down the line in an interview room.
Absolutely. Awareness is the first step to breaking out of that generalist trap.
So here is where we're going to leave you today. I want you to take a look at your own calendar. Look at the meetings you have scheduled, the reports you have to file, the approvals you need to get. And I want you to ask yourself the exact same question that the hiring manager asked the section chief in our opening story. If the vendors disappeared, if the consultants all quit, if the servers crashed, which part of the solution can you build with your own hands? If the answer is none, you might not actually have a job. You might just have a title. Thanks for diving deep with us.